It is actually 5 minutes after I made video 5.1, and I'm going to start video 5.2 right now. But notice I changed shirts just so it appears as though it's like the next day or something like that. My wife thought that would be a good idea. I don't know. Anyway, let's get started with 5.2, and I believe that begins on page 124. In your book on page 124, they talk about these different evolution terms. And basically what they're trying to let you know is evolution can occur at multiple levels. Microevolution is something that we can witness in our lifetimes. You know, for instance, we can see how a species will actually change into another species by observation. This is called microevolution because it's small evolution. It's certainly an evolution of a species, but it's something that's observable to us. Macroevolution is that natural selection changes over a long period of time. And when it happens and actually creates a new species, that's called speciation. And we'll get into the different ways that can happen here in a few minutes. But in general, it's important for us to know that we humans can have a very important role in microevolution. Certainly farming and the different great varieties of plants that we've established over the last few hundred years have made a big difference in our productivity when it comes to being able to grow foods and even improve on foods. You know, there are some mixes of species involved in the plant world when it comes to things like fruit, for instance. But macroevolution is the change over a very long period of time. And by the way, when we talk about evolution, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about natural change that occurs over a long period of time. And that process of change is called natural selection. Now, I know that this can get controversial, but let's just stick with the science on this here. And the fact that these changes over time occur, and it takes a great deal of time for evolution to occur. As a matter of fact, the theory of evolution, one of the things that's vitally important as a underpinning of the theory is that the Earth has to be as old as, our geologists tell us it is, because evolution does not happen in a short period of time. And I'll ask you in class tomorrow, what's your definition of evolution? And maybe I can debunk one or two of your thought processes there. All right, so how does evolution occur? Well, it occurs because of genetic diversity. And this gets back to the point that I made in 5.1. And that is that a species needs to have lots of different traits available to it in order for evolution to be successful. And remember something critically important in all this. In fact, write it down if you can't remember it. In order for evolution to occur, something has to change in the environment. If nothing changes, then there is no reason for one trait to sort of dominate another trait. Something has to change in the ecosystem for this to occur. But when that something changes, we need to have enough different genetic diversity within the species to be able to handle that change. Let's get some other definitions out of the way. Genotype is the actual genetic code for an organism. So you can have brown eyes, that would be your phenotype, that's your physical attribute. But your genotype is whether you've got the dominant and the recessive or both dominants for that particular trait. So that's your genotype, is your actual genetic code. Phenotype is the physical trait that shows as a result of what your genotype is. So phenotypes can vary, sometimes just by the code, but sometimes phenotypes vary by temperature. It's a known fact that in some species of alligator, for instance, that depending on the temperature when the egg is laid for the female, determines whether or not that new embryo that's in that egg is going to end up being male or female. So some genotypes, I mean, the genotype doesn't change, right? That was created at conception when the first sperm met the first egg and that new cell was formed. But the phenotype is variable. You know, the same genetic code, and you could get a male or a female gator based on the temperature that the egg is incubating at. All right, one of the ways that we can create genetic diversity is through something called mutation. And that's just where the normal genetic code is what it is, but then something changes, and this has to be either with a sperm or an egg, and that new genetic code problem causes a mutation, causes a change in the DNA structure. Now, we're not going to know whether that mutation actually occurred or not unless something changes in the environment. For instance, let's say all of the foxes are brown-haired, but every now and then we have a mutation occur during meiosis, and either the sperm or the egg has a problem, and we end up with a few white-colored foxes. Well, that's a mutation, and it happens, you know, when you deal with the numbers that we're dealing with in terms of cellular divisions, the chances that there's a mutation in the sex cells is pretty good. So if we examine all of the foxes in the ecosystem, let's say there's thousands of them, there might always be a few white ones. That's a genetic mutation. The thing that's going to change the species, though, is whether or not something changes in the ecosystem and gives those few white-haired foxes an advantage that they didn't used to have. That's the key thing. All right, and then we have recombination. Recombination is when we have things like crossing over during meiosis, during the reproductive cell division. And when crossing over happens, we actually have a new gene form on the DNA. If that new gene form happens, it's not necessarily a mutation, but it does alter the genetic code of the new organism should that sperm fertilize that particular egg, whether it's the sperm or the egg that underwent the crossing over. Recombination is a big problem, not in advanced species like ours, but it's a big deal with bacteria. We have a lot of recombination happening with bacteria, and you know, we fear that an accidental recombination could end up with antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. And we can talk more about that a little bit later too when we talk about natural selection. So I think I covered everything on that slide. We're good to move on. So here are the three ways that evolution occurs. First of all, it can happen artificially, and I think I have a picture to show you that. Yeah, it can happen artificially. That is to say, we kind of cause it to happen. And that's what we mean by artificial selection. It's when humans determine what an important trait is, and then we try to push that trait and push that trait, making sure that only the same organisms with the same trait reproduce successfully. And that's called artificial selection. And again, we use this an awful lot in farming. And, you know, we've used it over the years, for instance, when it comes to breeding dogs, right? Dogs have a certain trait. They're excellent hunters, or, you know, whatever the trait might be. And so we made sure that our excellent hunter males only would mate with excellent hunting females. And that would increase the chances that their offspring would be excellent hunters too. A lot of these traits that are in dogs, for instance, it's amazing to think that they are actually inbred traits. To me, you'd think that they would be something that's learned. But it is definitely something that's in their genetic code that makes them act the way they do. So whether you're talking about breeding dogs or breeding plants, we're talking about artificial selection. Natural selection, of course, is happening over long periods of time, and it's a natural process. Natural selection, of course, is the concept that Darwin first presented to us in his treatise back in the 1800s. And one of the most important things that he told us about natural selection was that these are random processes, that these changes in the genetic code happen randomly through a mutation, for instance, or some sort of an adaptation. And I'm going to cover the 4 different random processes coming up right now. Now, you know that Darwin's theory of natural selection included in the important idea of fitness. You know, how well is the organism set to survive in its natural surroundings? And for something to change, then the advantages change. You know, in my silly example of the wolves, what happens if there's 50 years of way too much snow in the area that these foxes are living? Well, you can imagine that having a white colored fur might be an advantage over a dark colored fur. Maybe you could hide from predators, something along those lines. Or maybe thicker fur versus thinner fur. But something changes in the ecosystem, and through natural selection, we see that, you know, over thousands of years, we have a separate species of white foxes. Yeah, there always were the dark foxes, and there were always a few white foxes, but now the white foxes seem to dominate. This sound familiar? It might remind you of the peppered moth example that we always use when we try to discuss microevolution. So this diagram's in your book. It's just showing you that the wolf is the ancestor of various breeds of dog, and just over time we have taken the time to artificially select those particular organisms. In the book, they also talk about the different species that we have artificially selected for that are related to the wild mustard, and you can see them all here. These are all great vegetables that we seem to give us good nutrition, and we like them. And they're all genetically engineered unwittingly by us. I mean, this is before we knew anything about genetics, but we just through artificial selection created new species from the mustard plant. All right, so here is natural selection. We talked about the first one was the random process. So here is natural selection. And you can see the example here. In this crustacean known as an amphipod, parents produce offspring that vary in body size. All right, so you have some regular size and you always have one smaller one. The larger offspring are more easily seen and eaten by fish. So over time, the smaller offspring are the ones that are surviving, and they are reproducing with other smaller offspring. And you know, before we know it, we end up, by the 3rd generation, we end up with 3-to-1 ratio of smaller offspring to large offspring. And then by the time the 4th generation comes, we can see this is natural selection. If it occurs over many generations, right? This is not something that happens overnight. That's the whole idea here. This is macro evolution. All right, so these random processes can happen. And here are the 5 tenets of Darwin's theories. One of the things important to note that Darwin noticed, if individuals produce just enough offspring to survive, then natural selection can't occur. There has to be an excess of offspring so that the genetic diversity remains high and that the offspring that have the best genetic code and are best equipped to survive in the ecosystem do so. He noted that not all offspring are going to survive. There's going to be genetic advantages and genetic disadvantages. And those advantages and disadvantages are called traits. Here's another important thing to remember. The differences in traits must be passed downable. They've got to be able to be passed down from parent to offspring. You know, I always make this joke. If I had an accident, you know, with my chainsaw and cut off my pinky, does that mean my children are going to be born with 9 fingers? Of course not. And you can see how silly that is, because what happened to me is not in my genetic code. What changes has to be passed downable. It has to be in the sperm and in the eggs. And then here's the difference thing, right? Has to be associated with the ability to survive or to reproduce. You know, some species can survive just fine, but their genetic difference makes them unable to reproduce. So in that case, of course, the genetic difference cannot be passed down. If they can't reproduce, they can't pass it on to offspring. So those are the basic tenets of Darwin's theory. Here's the graphic on random processes. And again, this is all in the context of how natural selection can occur. In some cases, it happens by simply having a mutation. And in this case, we have the different colored mice here. Always had, you know, some black mice. But if the black mice are able to stick around long enough to reproduce themselves, that genetic mutation can be passed down to the offspring. And so over a long period of time and multiple generations, we can see an increase in the number of black mice in this population. Now, genetic drift happens with large populations, and genetic shift occurs when some genotypes are lost by chance. In this case, we see a very, very large population of mice. The genetic composition tends to remain the same over time, but when we get a smaller population, we can see big changes. As in this example, the population was 60-40, but over time, you know, and again, this is a random occurrence, but it can happen. And if it does happen, then we end up with a completely different phenotype for the mice. Whereas you once thought of mice as 40-60, now we see them to be 100% white. This is the kind of genetic drift. All that means is the genes are sort of drifting towards one particular outcome. By randomness. It just happens. It only really happens, though, when we see small populations. So that's what you want to write down for genetic drift. Happens with small populations. With the bottleneck effect, here's something that changes in the ecosystem, right? Some genotypes will be lost because something drastic happens with the size of the species. Let's say, I don't know, there's a flood. So you've got all of these different species of mice, and then there's a flood. And all that remained left, there was no white mice remaining. They're the survivors. So now they're in the bottleneck. There aren't very many of them, but they reproduce and they pass on their trait to their offspring, and we end up with no white mice in the population. And that happens because a bottleneck occurred. The bottleneck in my example was a flood. And then the fourth random process is called the founder effect. And that's when if a few individuals get completely separated from the others, right? The mainland population colonizes an island. And so now only the genotype of the new population is available for the species that's on that island. And so now the phenotype for these mice is quite a bit different than what it was in the large scale numbers back there on the mainland. So you can see from the name founder, we're talking about the founding of a new species in an altogether new area. So think of this in terms of an island, all right, where the species gets completely cut off. We end up with an entirely new genotype. Study that diagram in your book. If you have any questions, please bring them to class. Okay, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover in that video. Was that one short and sweet enough? I think it was. So I will stop now, and I will cover the last two sections that are in Chapter 5, probably in... No, I was going to try to make that in one video. I doubt that I can. All right. See you later. Bye for now.